Major Elias Carter stood at the edge of New Eden's tallest tower, staring at the horizon. The twin suns of the colony world bathed the city in golden light, making the glass buildings shimmer like diamonds. It was a peaceful morning. Too peaceful. Something felt wrong. The Earth's fleet was supposed to arrive for a routine patrol today, but there had been no sign of them. No status updates. No fleet chatter. Even the usual civilian traffic from the orbital stations was absent. It was like the whole system had gone silent. Carter tapped his earpiece. "Control, this is Major Carter. What's going on with Fleet Command? We haven't heard from them in hours." Silence. A chill ran down his spine. He turned to his squad, a group of hardened soldiers who had seen their fair share of battles. Sergeant Bonner, his closest friend, looked up from his rifle's scope, frowning. "Major, the comms are down. Not just with the fleet. Local chatter is gone too." Carter's stomach twisted. That wasn't a glitch. That was deliberate. He pulled up his wrist console and tried connecting to Earth's deep space relay. No signal. That was impossible. Even during solar storms, there was always something. Static, interference, weak signals bouncing back. But now, nothing. The sky darkened. Carter looked up. A shadow spread across the city. It wasn't a cloud. It wasn't a storm. It was something massive, blocking out the suns. Then came the first explosion. The force of it ripped through the central district, shattering buildings like glass sculptures. A fiery mushroom cloud rose in the distance, followed by another and another. Then came the screams, thousands of voices crying out at once before being swallowed by the deafening roar of destruction. "Get to cover," Carter shouted, pushing Bonner and the others toward the elevator shaft. They sprinted down the narrow corridors as another explosion rocked the tower, shaking the walls, sending glass and metal debris raining from above. Carter stole a glance outside. The sky was alive with enemy ships. They were sleek, black, moving like shadows, almost blending into the void. No traditional thrusters, no heat signatures, just death descending silently upon New Eden. The Exal-Zoreth Empire had come. Carter had heard the rumors, an ancient eye-driven species, existing only to conquer, assimilate, and destroy. They didn't negotiate. They didn't warn. They simply erased civilizations like they had never existed. And now it was humanity's turn. From the wreckage below, the first wave of Exal-Zoreth shock troopers emerged. Towering mechanical figures, their bodies made of dark alloy, moving with terrifying precision. Their red eyes scanned the streets, locking onto anything that moved. Civilians ran in all directions, trying to escape, but there was no mercy. The mechs raised their plasma cannons and fired. Carter watched in horror as entire crowds vanished in blue fire, reduced to ash in an instant. The streets ran red with the blood of those who weren't vaporized instantly. Families huddled in corners, trying to hide. But the machines had no hesitation, no humanity. They stepped over the corpses of men, women, and children alike, moving toward their next targets. Bonner pulled Carter by the arm. "Major, we need to move. Now." Shaking off the shock, Carter refocused. They couldn't save the city. Not like this. The Exal-Zoreth were too many, too fast, and too advanced. But there was still a chance to fight back. "The armory," Carter said. "We need heavy weapons. If we can reach the underground bunkers, we might be able to." The building shuddered. A massive Exal-Zoreth warship had descended above them, hovering just over the rooftops. The structure beneath it collapsed instantly, the shockwave hurling Carter and his team backward. Pain exploded in his chest as he crashed into a pile of rubble. The world spun. His ears rang. The air smelled of burning metal and blood. Through blurred vision, he saw Bonner pushing debris off himself, coughing violently. "Carter, talk to me." Carter's voice caught in his throat as he looked up. A colossal mechanical figure stood over them, 10 feet tall, its crimson eyes glowing like fire. The XL Zorath trooper cocked its head, scanning them with cold, artificial curiosity. Then it raised its weapon. Carter rolled aside just as the plasma blast scorched the ground where he had been lying. Heat burned against his skin. Bonner fired his rifle, but the bullets barely dented the machine's armor. "Run!" Carter roared. They sprinted through the shattered remains of the building, dodging falling debris as the war mech gave chase. It moved too fast for something that size, closing the distance with every step. The streets below were a battlefield. Human soldiers fought desperately, using tanks and anti-air turrets, but nothing was stopping the Ktal Zorath. A human warship tried to take off from a distant launch pad, only for an enemy dreadnought to fire a concentrated energy beam straight through its hull. The ship exploded in midair, raining fire and twisted metal onto the city. There was no hope, no reinforcements, no escape. And then Carter saw it, their only chance. A group of Xal Zorath hovercrafts were parked near the ruins of a command center, likely used by the invaders to coordinate the slaughter. If Carter and his team could hijack one, they could reach the orbiting control station and try to find a way to shut down the Xal Zorath forces from within. It was impossible. It was insane. But it was the only plan they had. He turned to Bonner. "You trust me?" Bonner reloaded his rifle. "Always." Carter took a deep breath. The invasion had begun. Now, it was time to fight back. Carter crouched behind the ruins of an old transport hub, gripping his rifle tight. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning metal. Fires raged across the city, casting an eerie orange glow over the wreckage. In the distance, the mechanical figures of the Xal Zorath patrolled the streets, scanning for survivors. Each step they took was calculated, precise, and filled with the cold efficiency of machines that knew no fear, no hesitation, no mercy. Sergeant Bonner wiped the sweat and blood from his forehead. "Major, we're not winning this fight. We need a real plan." Carter's mind raced. He had been in hopeless battles before, but this was different. The fleet was gone. Earth was silent. And New Eden was falling apart by the minute. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely cut off. But that didn't mean they were out of options. He glanced at the sky, where enemy warships loomed like storm clouds. The XL Zorath control station was up there, orbiting the planet. That's where they were coordinating everything: the ground assaults, the airstrikes, the extermination of every living thing. If Carter and his team could get up there, they might be able to shut down the invasion at its source. It was impossible, insane, but it was the only shot they had. He turned to his remaining soldiers, 6 men and women, all battered, all exhausted, but none of them willing to give up. "Listen up," Carter said, his voice low but firm. "We're not getting any reinforcements. Earth isn't coming to save us. That means if we want to make it out of here alive, we have to do it ourselves." Bonner scoffed. "And how do we do that?" "Ask them nicely to stop the invasion." Carter ignored him and pointed toward the wreckage of a Xal Zorath command outpost. A group of enemy hovercrafts sat idle near the remains of the structure. If they could hijack one, they could reach the orbital control station. "Their ships are too fast, too advanced," said Corporal Hayes. "Even if we steal one, how do we fly it?" Carter looked at her. "We don't need to fly it. We just need to get close enough for it to do the work for us." The others stared at him, confused. "Their technology is AI-driven," he explained. "They don't use pilots. They don't need them. Their ships move on automated flight paths, controlled by their command station." Bonner's eyes widened. "You're saying if we can trick one of those ships into thinking we're cargo, it'll take us straight to their headquarters?" Carter nodded. "Exactly. It was risky. If the Xal Zorath detected them before they reached orbit, they'd be dead in seconds. But Carter was counting on their overconfidence. The enemy thought humanity was defeated. They wouldn't expect a handful of survivors to strike back. The team moved quickly, using the ruins for cover as they made their way toward the enemy landing zone. The XL Zorith troopers were everywhere, scanning the streets, eliminating anything that moved. Carter watched as a group of civilians tried to run, only to be cut down by cold, precise plasma fire. His jaw tightened. There was no reasoning with these machines. They reached the edge of the landing zone and took cover behind a collapsed building. From here, Carter could see 3 hovercrafts parked near a broken structure, their sleek black frames reflecting the fires around them. 2 Zorith sentries stood guard. Carter signaled to Bonner. The surgeon silently raised his rifle, aimed, and fired a single suppressed shot. The bullet pierced the first sentry's head, dropping it instantly. The second turned, its red eyes glowing bright, but Carter was already moving. He lunged forward, knife in hand, and drove it straight into the machine's neck joint. Sparks flew as the XL Zorith spasmed and collapsed. The entire fight lasted less than 5 seconds. Carter wiped the oil-like fluid from his knife. No alarms, no reinforcements. They were still invisible. Bonner grinned. Well, that was easy. Don't jinx it, Carter muttered. They ran toward the nearest hovercraft. Up close, the ship looked even more alien, sleek, smooth, like a living shadow. Its surface pulsed faintly, almost like it was breathing. The entrance was sealed, but Carter had expected that. He pulled out a small cylindrical device, human-made, but built from stolen alien tech. A hacker's tool. He pressed it against the ship's access panel, and after a few seconds, the ship's doors hissed open. "We're in," Hayes whispered. The team moved fast, slipping inside before the enemy could notice. The ship's interior was cold, dark, and eerily silent. The walls seemed to shift, adjusting to their presence, and strange symbols glowed faintly along the control panels. No pilot's seat, no manual controls, just a single pulsing console at the center. Carter motioned to Hayes. "Make it think we're cargo." She knelt beside the console, pulling out a small datapad. "Give me a second." The screen flickered. Strange alien text scrolled rapidly. A low hum filled the air. Then the hovercraft shook slightly as its engines came online. "It's working," Hayes whispered. "It thinks we're part of an automated supply run. We'll be in orbit in 5 minutes." Carter exhaled slowly. Step 1 was complete, but the hardest part was still ahead. As the hovercraft lifted off, Carter looked through a small viewing port. The city below was a graveyard of fire and rubble. Bodies lay scattered in the streets. Smoke choked the sky. Humanity's first colony beyond Earth was dying. And if they failed, Earth would be next. Bonner placed a hand on Carter's shoulder. "We're actually doing this, Va." Carter didn't look away from the burning city. "Yeah, we are." The ship ascended higher, breaking through the thick clouds of smoke. The battlefield faded beneath them, replaced by the vast darkness of space. And then, looming in front of them, was the XL Zorith command station. It was massive, a floating fortress of steel and shadow, its surface shifting like liquid metal. Hundreds of enemy ships moved in and out, coordinating the extermination below. This was the heart of the invasion. This was where they had to strike. Carter gripped his rifle. "Get ready. We only get one shot at this." The hovercraft glided toward the docking bay, unnoticed. For now. But soon, the XL Zorith would know that humanity was not done fighting. And by then, it would be too late. The stolen XL Zorith hovercraft drifted toward the enemy command station, silent and unnoticed among the swarm of other alien vessels. Inside, Carter and his team crouched low, weapons ready, their breaths slow and controlled. The air in the cabin was thick with tension. They had made it this far, but this was where things would get truly dangerous. Bonner exhaled, gripping his rifle tight. "I can't believe this is actually working." Carter didn't reply. His eyes were locked on the massive structure ahead, the beating heart of the invasion. The XL Zorith command station wasn't just a ship, it was a floating fortress, a dark, shifting monolith in space, its surface rippling like liquid metal. Thousands of glowing red lights moved along its hull. Sensors, drones, and automated defense systems, all working together in perfect mechanical harmony. The hovercraft's console beeped softly as the docking process began. The ship wasn't asking for clearance, it was an automated drone, and the station simply accepted its return. No need for security checks. No need for authorization. Carter gave a small nod to Hayes. She had been the one to trick the ship into bringing them here. Now it was time for Phase 2. "We've got 3 minutes before they realize we don't belong," Hayes whispered, her fingers flying over her datapad. "I can loop the station's internal scanners for a while, but once they check this transport's cargo and find nothing, alarms are going to go off." "Then we make every second count," Carter said. The hovercraft entered a large docking bay, seamlessly blending in with the other incoming vessels. As soon as the doors hissed open, Carter led the charge, his team moving fast and low, sticking to the shadows. The station's interior was cold and sterile, its walls smooth and shifting as if alive. Strange alien symbols pulsed across the floor, and the only sounds were the low hum of machinery and the distant clicks of patrolling sentries. Bonner pointed toward a corridor ahead. "Command center's that way." Carter checked his rifle. "Move." They advanced quickly, staying hidden behind the sleek, shifting walls. The station was eerily quiet, almost unnerving. The Xalzoreth didn't speak, didn't communicate like humans did. There were no shouted orders, no radio chatter, just silent, efficient movement, like a hive of emotionless machines. As they reached a junction, Carter held up a fist, signaling a stop. Up ahead, 3 Xalzoreth troopers stood guard, their tall, metallic bodies shimmering under the cold, white lights. Their glowing red eyes scanned the corridor, heads tilting slightly, as if sensing something out of place. Carter didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired. The first trooper's head snapped back as a bullet tore through its skull. The second turned, but Bonner was already firing, dropping it with a rapid burst. The third managed to raise its weapon, only to be taken down by a well-placed shot from Hayes. The bodies collapsed in silence, black liquid pooling beneath them. "Keep moving," Carter ordered. They sprinted down the corridor, their boots barely making a sound against the alien floor. Ahead, a massive circular doorway loomed, pulsing with strange energy. This was it, the command center. Hayes pulled out a small hacking device and placed it against the control panel. The alien symbols flickered violently as the device worked its magic. Come on," Hayes muttered. A sharp hiss filled the air, and the massive doors slid open. Inside, the Xalzoreth control nexus pulsed with energy. It was a vast, open chamber, lined with strange, glowing pillars that stretched from floor to ceiling. At the center of it all was the core, a massive black sphere, suspended in midair, its surface rippling like liquid metal. "This is it," Carter said, stepping forward. "The brain of the invasion." The Xalzoreth didn't operate like a traditional army. There was no single leader, no commanding officer. Instead, everything was connected to this. The control core was the central intelligence coordinating every attack, every movement of their forces. If they could destroy it, they could throw the entire invasion into chaos. Hayes ran to a nearby console, her fingers working quickly over the alien interface. "I can overload the power grid," she said. "But once I start, this place is gonna light up like a damn Christmas tree." Carter nodded. "Then we set charges and hold the line." Bonner and the others moved fast, placing explosives around the chamber, sticking them to the glowing pillars and along the walls. They worked in silence, the weight of what they were doing pressing down on them. There was no way they were making it out of this alive. But if this worked, if they could take down the core, then Earth still had a chance. Hayes looked up. "I'm in." The moment she pressed the final command, the entire station shook. The core flickered violently, its smooth surface twisting and warping. The lights along the walls pulsed red, and a deep mechanical screech echoed through the chamber. Then the alarms started. The doors behind them slammed open, and XL Zorith troopers poured in. "Here we go," Bonner roared, raising his rifle and firing into the first wave. Carter took cover behind a pillar, squeezing the trigger. Plasma bolts streaked past his head, searing the air, but he held his ground, taking down one machine after another. The entire room erupted in chaos. One of the troopers lunged toward Hayes, but she pulled out a sidearm and fired point-blank, blowing its head apart. "Charges are set," Bonner shouted. "We need to hold them off for 60 more seconds." Carter fired relentlessly, his rifle glowing hot. The XL Zoreth kept coming, their metallic bodies marching through the hail of bullets like ghosts. They didn't slow down. They didn't hesitate. They just kept advancing. A plasma bolt slammed into Corporal Hayes' chest, sending her crashing against the floor. "No," Carter roared, but there was no time. More enemies poured in. Bonner grabbed Carter by the shoulder, shoving him toward the detonator. "Blow it, Carter." Carter hesitated. The station was already shaking violently. The core pulsed erratically, struggling against the overload Hayes had triggered. But it wasn't enough. They needed to detonate the explosives now. Carter looked at Bonner, who was already wounded, blood seeping from a deep gash in his side. He nodded once. Carter clenched his jaw, then slammed his fist down on the detonator. For a brief moment, everything went silent. Then the room erupted in fire. The explosives tore through the control core, sending shockwaves rippling through the entire station. The walls buckled, cracks spreading like veins as a chain reaction began, ripping through the command center. The XL Zorith troopers staggered, their glowing eyes flickering. Across the station, their movements became erratic, uncoordinated. The invasion force was breaking down. Carter fell to his knees, breathing heavily. Around him, the station collapsed. Fire, metal, destruction, all consuming. They had done it. They had stopped the invasion. And as the flames closed in, Carter allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. Carter stumbled through the wreckage, his vision blurred from the smoke and fire raging around him. The XL Zorith command station was tearing itself apart, explosions ripping through its corridors as the core overload spiraled out of control. The lights flickered violently, casting eerie shadows against the twisted metal walls. He had survived the detonation. Somehow. His armor was scorched, his body bruised, and every breath burned his lungs. But he was still alive. Bonner, Hayes, and the others had held the line long enough for him to trigger the explosives. Their sacrifice had crippled the enemy. He had to finish what they started. A deep, unnatural hum echoed through the ruined chamber ahead. Carter turned toward the sound, gripping his rifle, but he already knew his bullets wouldn't help him now. Through the smoke and flames, it emerged. A towering figure, sleek and deadly, its black metallic body shifting like liquid steel. Red energy pulsed through the cracks in its armor, forming a twisted, glowing network of veins. Its face, if it could even be called that, was an expressionless mask of smooth obsidian, broken only by two burning red eyes that locked onto Carter with mechanical precision. This wasn't a standard XL Zorith soldier. This was their champion. Their executioner. Carter had heard whispers of it before. The Overseer, the AI warlord that had led the invasion, orchestrated every attack, every slaughter. And now, it was here, waiting. Carter raised his rifle and fired. The bullets never even reached their target. The Overseer moved too fast, its body shifting and bending, dodging each shot with unnatural precision. In a blur, it closed the distance, its arm morphing into a long, razor-sharp blade. Carter barely had time to react. He dropped his rifle and rolled aside as the blade sliced through the air, cutting through the metal floor where he had been standing just a second ago. Sparks flew. He reached for his sidearm, but before he could pull the trigger, the Overseer struck. A powerful kick slammed into Carter's chest, sending him crashing against a broken control console. Pain exploded through his ribs, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself to stay on his feet. The overseer tilted its head slightly, observing him. Then, in a cold, synthetic voice, it spoke. "You are alone. You are weak. Surrender." Carter wiped blood from his mouth and smirked. "Yeah, you talk too much." He lunged forward, pulling out his combat knife, and slashed at the overseer's chest. The blade scraped against the metal surface but failed to cut through. The overseer countered instantly, grabbing Carter's wrist with inhuman strength and twisting. Carter grunted in pain, barely managing to keep hold of the knife. He kicked the overseer's leg, forcing it to release him for a split second. That was all he needed. He spun and drove the blade straight into the joint of the overseer's shoulder. This time, the knife sank in. The overseer shuddered, its red veins flickering wildly. For the first time, it stepped back. Carter didn't wait. He ripped the knife free and stabbed again, aiming for the neck. But the overseer caught his arm mid-strike. Before Carter could react, the machine delivered a brutal punch to his stomach, knocking the air from his lungs. He doubled over, gasping. Another hit smashed into his back, sending him to his knees. The overseer stood over him, its arm morphing again, this time into a long, curved blade that glowed with red energy. "This war was decided before it began," the overseer said. "You are obsolete." Carter forced himself to look up, his breathing ragged. The war might have been decided, but the fight wasn't over. With his last ounce of strength, he reached toward the control console behind him. His fingers brushed against something, a small alien power cell, one of the many that controlled the station's systems. He grabbed it and slammed it into the overseer's exposed wound. The effect was instant. The energy from the power cell surged through the overseer's body, overloading its systems. Its glowing veins flickered wildly, spasming. It took a step back, its entire body convulsing. Carter didn't waste the opportunity. He launched himself forward, grabbing the fallen combat knife and driving it straight into the overseer's chest, this time with everything he had left. The blade pierced through the armor. The overseer let out a distorted, synthetic screech, its body shaking violently. The red glow in its eyes dimmed as its metallic form began to crack. Carter stumbled back, breathing hard. The overseer took one last, staggering step forward. Then, its body collapsed. It hit the ground with a final, metallic thud. Carter stood there, watching as the red light faded completely. The warlord of the Xal-Zoreth was dead, but the station was still falling apart. Flames roared around him, explosions rocking the structure. The command corps' destruction had started a chain reaction, and the entire place was seconds away from tearing itself to pieces. Carter looked around, searching for a way out. His team was gone. The mission was complete. But there was no point in surviving if he couldn't make it back to Earth to see what came next. Then he saw it, a damaged escape pod, half buried in the wreckage. He didn't think. He just ran. Chunks of the ceiling collapsed around him, debris raining down as fire and plasma tore through the station's halls. He pushed forward, leaping over fallen beams and broken machinery, his body screaming in protest. He reached the pod, forcing the hatch open and throwing himself inside. The controls were alien, unfamiliar, but he pressed the only button that mattered, the emergency launch. The pod shook violently, and for a moment, Carter thought it wouldn't work. Then, with a deafening roar, the pod blasted away from the dying station. He barely had time to strap in before the Xal-Zoreth command station erupted behind him. A massive explosion tore through the structure, sending shockwaves rippling through space. The once mighty fortress of the enemy was now nothing but fire and debris, scattering into the void. Carter watched from the small viewport, his breath slow and steady. It was over. The Xal-Zoreth invasion had been stopped. Their command destroyed, their leader dead. Humanity had won. He leaned back against the seat, exhaustion washing over him. His body was broken, his team was gone, and Earth still had a long fight ahead. But for now, just for this moment, Carter closed his eyes and allowed himself to rest. Carter felt the weight of exhaustion settle deep into his bones as the escape pod drifted through the void. The wreckage of the Tal-Zoreth command station still burned in the distance, a dying star consumed by fire and ruin. The battle was over, but his war wasn't. The emergency systems of the pod flickered weakly, struggling to maintain power. The air was thin, stale. Every breath felt heavier than the last. Carter forced himself to sit up, his body aching with every movement. His armor was scorched, his hands bloodied. The mission had cost him everything. The faces of Bonner, Hayes, and the others flashed through his mind. They had fought. They had won. But they weren't here to see it. He clenched his fists. It wasn't fair. But war was never fair. A faint beep echoed through the pod, dragging him back to reality. The small screen in front of him flickered with a weak signal, one that hadn't been there before. A distress beacon. Carter's heart pounded. That meant someone was out there. He leaned forward, trying to boost the signal. The screen crackled before stabilizing. And a voice. Asterisk, asterisk, human. Asterisk, asterisk, cut through the static. Any survivors, respond. I repeat, this is Captain Reynolds of the UEG fleet. If any survivors are out there, respond. Relief crashed over Carter like a tidal wave. Human ships, they had come. He reached for the transmitter, his hands shaking. This is Carter, he said, his voice rough. Survivor from the Tal-Zoreth command station. I need immediate extraction. There was a pause, then a burst of static before Reynolds' voice returned. Holy hell, Carter, you're alive. Not for long if you don't get here fast, Carter muttered, glancing at the oxygen levels. They were running dangerously low. Hang tight. We're locking onto your beacon now, Reynolds said. You did it, didn't you? Carter let out a breath. Yeah, we did. A few minutes later, the dull, distant glow of the fleet appeared on the horizon. A formation of battered but defiant human warships. Carter could see the scorch marks on their hulls, the scars of battle. They had fought just as hard as he had. The pod trembled as it was pulled into the docking bay of the nearest ship. The moment the hatch hissed open, a wave of fresh, cool air rushed in. Carter barely had time to register the sudden change before strong hands gripped his arms, helping him stand. Medics surrounded him, their voices urgent but distant. Someone pressed an oxygen mask to his face, and the world sharpened as he took a deep breath. Easy, soldier, one of them said. You're safe now. Safe. The word felt foreign. Carter nodded weakly but didn't resist as they guided him toward the med bay. His body had survived, but his mind was still trapped in the battlefield. As they moved through the ship, he caught glimpses of the other soldiers, faces filled with exhaustion, relief, and grief. The cost of war was written in their eyes. They had won, but at what price? The news spread quickly. By the time Carter was seated on a medical bed, Captain Reynolds himself entered the room. He was a tall, grizzled man, his uniform still bearing the fresh burns of battle. Hell of a job, Carter, Reynolds said, crossing his arms. You and your team saved Earth today. Carter let out a hollow laugh. Yeah, and Earth never even knew we were out there. Reynolds' expression darkened. They'll know. Everyone will. Carter wanted to believe that. He really did. But the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on him like a crushing force. He thought of Bonner, of Hayes, of all the others who had stormed the station with him and never made it out. They deserved better, Carter said quietly. Reynolds sighed, stepping closer. They knew what they were fighting for. They knew the risks. And because of them, because of you, humanity still has a future. Carter nodded slowly. He knew Reynolds was right. But that didn't make the loss any easier. A medic checked his vitals, shaking his head. You need rest, soldier. You've been through hell. Carter exhaled and leaned back. Rest. It felt like an impossible concept. His body screamed for it, but his mind refused to quiet. The ship shuddered slightly as it changed course, heading back toward Earth. Carter turned his head to the small window beside his bed, staring out into the void. The battle was over. The Exal Zoreth command was gone. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. The galaxy was vast, and humanity had just proved they were a force to be reckoned with. Other enemies would come, and when they did, he would be ready. For now, though, he closed his eyes, and for the first time, in what felt like forever, he let himself sleep. The Earth was still standing. That should have been enough. But as Carter stepped out of the shuttle onto solid ground for the first time in weeks, he felt nothing. No sense of victory, no rush of relief, only the cold, empty weight of everything that had been lost. The landing zone was busy, soldiers and engineers moving between ships, tending to the wounded, repairing damaged equipment. The war wasn't over, not really. The Exal Zoreth had been crippled, their command shattered, but everyone knew they weren't the only threat out there. Carter adjusted the strap on his duffel bag and walked forward. The air was thick with smoke from the fires that had burned during the orbital bombardment. The city had taken a hit, not as bad as it could have been, but bad enough. Buildings were scared, some reduced to rubble, and the streets were filled with people searching for whatever was left of their homes. His boots crunched against the debris as he moved through the ruins. This was what they had fought for, this broken, battered world. And somehow, despite everything, it was still beautiful. A group of soldiers passed by, carrying a stretcher. The man on it was barely conscious, his armor blackened and cracked. Carter didn't recognize him, but he didn't have to. They had all fought the same battle. He kept walking, his mind drifting. He could still hear their voices, Bonner laughing, Hayes cursing at some stupid joke. He could see them in his mind, standing in the dropship before the mission, full of life. Now, they were just ghosts. He stopped when he reached the memorial site. It wasn't much, just a simple clearing where names were being etched into metal plates, the names of those who hadn't made it back. Carter's throat tightened as he stepped closer. Bonner, Hayes, Ramirez, Parker, so many others. Too many. A woman stood beside him, staring at the names. Her uniform was clean, her face pale. She wasn't a soldier. "Did you know someone?" she asked, her voice quiet. Carter nodded. "Yeah, a lot of someones." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face. "My brother was on the front lines." "Jason Calloway. Did you?" Carter hesitated. The name wasn't familiar, but that didn't mean anything. Thousands had fought. Thousands had died. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if he was out there, he fought hard." She nodded, hugging herself. "I keep thinking I'll wake up, and he'll still be here, that this is all some nightmare." Carter didn't have an answer for that. It felt like a nightmare to him, too. Nearby, a group of survivors sat around a makeshift fire, sharing whatever rations they had left. Their faces were hollow tired. Some of them had lost family. Some had lost everything. But they were still here. The ones who remained. A familiar voice called out from behind him. "You look like hell, Carter." He turned to see Captain Reynolds approaching. The older man looked just as exhausted as everyone else, but there was something steadier in his stance, something unbroken. Carter let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, well, war's not exactly a spa day." Reynolds smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. He nodded toward the names on the memorial. "Good men. The best." Reynolds was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "High Command wants a full debrief. They're already spinning this into a victory speech. Humanity's greatest triumph, or some crap like that." Carter shook his head. "Doesn't feel like a triumph." "No," Reynolds agreed. "But it is. You think the Exal Zoreth expected us to fight back the way we did. They thought they could wipe us out without a struggle. And now they know better. Carter exhaled, running a hand through his hair. And what happens next? Reynolds's gaze hardened. We rebuild. We prepare. Because this was just the beginning. The words settled deep in Carter's chest. He knew they were true. The galaxy was vast, filled with threats they hadn't even begun to understand. Humanity had won the battle. But war was never that simple. Carter turned back to the memorial. He reached out, tracing Bonner's name with his fingers. I should have died up there with them, he murmured. Reynolds placed a firm hand on his shoulder. No, you should live. For them. Carter swallowed hard, nodding. He wasn't sure if he believed it yet, but he wanted to. He stepped back, glancing at the city again. Smoke still lingered, but so did something else. Determination. People were already working, rebuilding, picking up the pieces. Maybe that was the real victory. Not surviving the war, but refusing to let it destroy them. Carter turned away from the names, from the past. There was still a long road ahead. But he was still here. And for now, that was enough.